So, welcome everyone to this rather special Strength of the Numbers episode where we've got a panel debate around the continuity challenges that we're currently facing from crises, but in particular, how can we keep our businesses open and essential services running? And we've brought a number of fantastically experienced panelists from different sectors, industries, to maybe bounce around some ideas on how we can do this. And rather than me introduce all of them, how about I sort of let them introduce themselves? And our three panelists are Howard Cosby, Louise Miller, and Mike Attwood. And Howard, how about you give us a brief background on your career for our audience, please?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Andrew. Background is professional services, having worked across a fair number of years now with a number of diverse organisations, in particular looking at the processes within their supply chains. So the sort of organisations that we dealt with are people within the food and drink sector, from large supermarket retailers through to people who work in the leisure sector, hoteliers, restaurateurs, etc., etc. And also, as I mentioned, a fairly diverse range of other sectors, highlights being, for example, the automotive industry with their very complex supply chains, General Motors being, for example, a client for a fair number of years, and also in the health and well-being, both working with NHS supply chain and organisations like Walgreens Boots.
Awesome. Thanks, Howard. And Louise, coming to you, would you mind giving us a quick introduction to your career, please?
Not at all. I guess my career has always been in finance. I've spent the last 30 years in supply chain businesses, predominantly providing contract logistics and end-to-end supply chain services for a wide variety of businesses across a broad range of sectors. I started pretty much at the bottom. So I started finance as an apprentice, or similar to the apprentice schemes we have today. And I worked my way through a whole variety of roles. I now am essentially the finance director for one of DHL Supply Chain's business units in the UK, and the particular sector I focus on now is drinks logistics. So, okay.
Thanks. Oh, cool. Brilliant. That's brilliant, Louise. And Mike, over to yourself. Would you maybe give us a quick introduction to your career, please?
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Hello, everybody. I worked for Sainsbury's for 30 years in trading departments, looking at procurement, sourcing, supply chain, as well as profitability and market share, covering meat, produce and bakery, including 3 years on value capture. The last 12 years I've been working with Subway IPC, which is the purchasing and supply chain arm for Subway for the whole of Europe. And across both of those careers, I've got 36 years experience in business continuity and crisis management. And I wouldn't even start to list the number of crises that I've come across over the years, but I've written them all down if anybody's
Yeah, no, thanks, Mike, for that. And actually, that you mentioned crises, look, we're living, when we're recording this, we're actually living through one at the moment, this COVID-19 crisis affecting our different countries in different ways. And I think we all agree as panelists, to say a big thank you to those out in the front lines, the volunteers out there working together, keeping our communities safe and protected. So I just want to say a big thank you to those doing that for us, so we can have this conversation and share these great insights with you. And from another sort of great leader, Winston Churchill, once inferred that we should never waste a good crisis. So obviously we've got the coronavirus. Mike, you've lived through a few as the rest of us as well. And we've got climate change on the horizon, Brexit, the oil price shocks and so on. So loads of continuity challenges out there for businesses. So what are the main challenges that your teams and clients, organizations are dealing with? And maybe we start with you, Louise. Sort of what are the main challenges that you're running into from a continuity perspective?
I guess working in the drinks logistics business at the moment, that pretty much stopped overnight. So I guess one of the big challenges is, and as a finance professional, of course, you get catapulted into so what does that mean? How is the future going to unfold? And of course, the big challenge at the moment is none of us actually really know. So for us, the challenge has been communicating with our teams, trying to understand what the next steps might be, but most importantly, keeping our teams safe and working out how we stand every service up, internal services from home, essentially. So those have been the biggest challenges, but so far, actually, it's been pretty seamless, which has been great.
And just to delve that one deeper, I think others are going through similar challenges, Louise, but use the word seamless. Like, that's an interesting word to use in this crazy manic time we're living in.
and I guess, yeah, it is, isn't it? Maybe we just have a positive outlook because it's such an unusual situation that it has seemed seamless. I guess we had the benefit of seeing what was happening across the globe. So we knew it was only a matter of time before we were in the same sort of situation. So you have a little bit of ability to plan. So we are in a digitalized world anyhow. So to some extent, we had the facilities to work remotely already. We just probably didn't exploit them to the extent, well, we didn't exploit them to the extent that we are today. So I guess we had that bit of warning. We could do a little bit of planning. We could prepare our teams for what might come because we could see what was happening across the globe. And then we were able to act much more quickly, I would say, than we might otherwise have been able to do.
Thanks for those points, Louise, and those more optimistic ways of looking at it as well. but Mike, you mentioned about that list of crises we've already been through, and you've sort of led teams, value capture, and so on. Like is that a way we should be looking at such challenges, or are there other challenges as well that we that are new that we might not have maybe encountered before? How are you looking at the present crises we're living through?
Well, I have to say this crisis is different from anything we've had before. Although the principles that we've tried to apply to work through it have been learnt from the previous experiences. I can't draw on anything that's happened in the past because I wasn't alive in 1918 when the last pandemic hit, or the global pandemic hit, and the Ebola in Africa and the SARS didn't really get beyond the regions where they started. So we've never had anything like this. But we have adapted, as Louise said. We've always had an element of home working. We've just ramped that up to make almost everybody home working for the last 6 weeks, I think it is. And then we've had to close all the Subway stores. So all the Subway stores chose to be closed themselves because every Subway is a franchise right across Europe. And the decision was made, certainly for the UK and Ireland, to close in the middle of March. And depending on the market, some stores have closed and some haven't. So in Scandinavia, they've broadly kept going with some controls around spacing and masks and things. But in Italy, it's obviously closed down completely. Spain has closed down completely because of the extreme impact there. So sitting in the middle of all that, we've had to try and manage our franchisees because we are a franchisee organisation and we are there to serve them and nothing else. We've got different challenges in different markets depending on how that market has responded to the crisis. So having shut down a number of markets, we're now looking to reopen stores, and the conditions by which those stores can reopen, either doing deliveries and things, have all been looked at by individuals in the team to try and get the businesses going again, because without sales, the Subway business is paralysed essentially. So not quite a challenge to E. coli or floods or anything else that's gone over the years, but the principles, we stick with our principles and we work through it in that way.
And I guess just touching on that point, Mike, around those particular businesses have all closed, there's quite a lot that have had to keep going. So for instance, in the supply chain business, the food still gets to the supermarkets. We're still receiving deliveries for whatever it is we order online. So it's how do we learn from those organisations that have had to continue to operate, implementing the social distancing measures, because they've done it and they had to almost stand that up as well. at quite short notice. So maybe the businesses who are now thinking, how do we start up, can also look at the ones who've had to keep going. So the supermarkets, for instance, during the situation, and we learn from them. And probably in some cases, manufacturing has already been stood up for the extra things that those organisations need to operate safely. But
Absolutely.
I think we can learn from each other, can't we, through this too?
Well, it's almost like a war situation. When a war breaks out, going back to the Second World War, for example, the industry had to respond to the needs of the war economy rather than doing what it did day to day. And what the industry is doing now here is manufacturing PPE and some of the things that needed to support the current crisis. So garment manufacturers have switched to making gowns rather than overcoats. Mm-hmm. So all these things have been going on, and I'm not sure how many of those would have been planned in some sort of continuity situation, but people have adapted to it in a matter of weeks, as they would have done in the 40s for the war.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, using the war analogy there, Mike, I was going to maybe put the question to Howard. Howard, do you think, given these challenges, do we have the necessary weapons or ammunition of mass adjustment, whatever way we want to describe it, to be successfully emerging in the face of all these challenges?
I personally think that one of the key things here, and Louise referred to it, is the speed with which this has come upon us in this particular instance. So if you make a comparison, and none of these analogies are valid to 100%, but for example, there was a program on the television the other day, Mike's old stomping ground of Sainsbury's, where Patrick Miller, who's in charge of the supply chain and is somebody that Mike knows from some years back, was pointing out that there was no prep time in comparison to, for example, well, Brexit is coming around the corner. Well, actually, months and months and months and years of prep for Brexit. This was something that came so quickly that the speed of reaction has, to my mind's eye, been nothing other than impressive across so many different ways, without, kicking the political football and talking about the government's reaction. I think the way that businesses have responded has been quite remarkable. And the finance community, as Louise mentioned, has to be at the forefront of this, because of the reality is that people need to make decisions based on facts, and that is the forte of the financial community. It is a fact-based community. Having spent a fair amount of my career working with finance functions across the type of organisations I mentioned earlier, that there's a plethora of information that is available to them. And for example, Patrick Miller is a qualified to actually have those people, steering the ship. That type of person steering the ship is hugely important at moments like this, because, as I say, it's their natural territory. Fact-based decisions made quickly as best as one can, based upon the information that's available at the time. And from there onwards is a knowledge management piece. Constantly adapting, constantly learning from information that is arriving, in this instance, almost daily, about what needs to be done. And as I say, I think it's been more impressive than most people can imagine, because most of the general public don't understand how complex these supply chains are.
So how are we getting the right knowledge to make these decisions around the complex supply chains that we have? I mean, Louise, is there any sort of particular data points you're using to guide the decision making of the business?
So I actually think it's the government's communication, to be fair. Our CEO says in situations like this, it's communicate. And I think they're actually doing, I don't want to get into politics, but I think they're doing a fantastic job keeping us up to date with the facts, same time every day, so people can just tune into that routine. And they're doing much more detailed briefs behind the scenes. So with engagement from big businesses, almost teams being able to put very specific questions in around how do we deal with this, have you thought about that, and so on. So it's almost, I feel as though the government in the background, they're providing a lot of the data for us to understand when things might change and where we are in the current situation. But in the background, they're leveraging the strength of the various industries to do that more detailed planning. We take a lot of information from the government briefing, and we're also attached to certain, obviously the health and safety executive. There are forums that are stood up where industries are discussing how do we safely, so in the beer market, how do we safely deliver to a pub if we have to observe social distancing when we have two men in a cab. So at the moment, you can't do that safely. So we are having to work together of those challenges. But I think we're using the government information mainly.
That's interesting. I just hadn't really thought about maybe putting such a reliance on the government information. Of course, obviously helps. But I was just thinking to the thing that maybe was on people's minds in our part of the world before Corona hit was probably Brexit. That's why I go over to you, Mike. It's like, okay, do we still need to be mindful of Brexit? Is it, or do we need to switch our focus to Corona, or should we also be thinking about Brexit at this moment, Mike?
Well, Brexit's been planned, as Louise mentioned earlier as well, in terms of we've known the dates when Brexit was due to happen. So we planned for each of those dates as they came and went, and we stood down the stock build that was going on ahead of that to avoid any supply chain impact. And we'll come back to that as soon as we get this out of the way, because we've obviously got the end of this year as the next watershed, and obviously we won't know until the June deadline around the negotiations with the EU as to what scenario we're going to be faced. But having done it twice before, I think we're all pretty confident and slick about how we do. How we'll respond in the summer to what we need to do for next January. I think Louise made a good point as well about the government set the sort of context for the crisis. Many crises in the past have happened without government being too bothered about it on the face of it. So when we've had floods in the UK, we had a fuel crisis, and business was really left on its own to figure out for itself what needed to be done. And that's where the principles and things that we're applying now come from. But having the government context is quite helpful, because we know the lockdown exists. We know the lockdown's probably going to last several more weeks. We know about the distancing. We know what the government's doing in terms of supply of PPE. There's all these things going on. So we have something to work with, whereas other crises, you're very much on your own. Mm-hmm.
That's a very interesting observation, Mike. And Howard, in terms of piecing that together, because I sort of, we've got the government maybe set in the context of business now, and they're coming together a bit more, maybe working more closely together. I can't help but feel mentioning a link to a video you sent me. It was this Bill Gates TED talk about the next pandemic. And I have to say, like, if I sort of had my time over, his warnings about what we're going through now were very prescient. And I'm trying to think, could we have done something better in finance and business and government to get ahead of this? I mean, sort of, what are your thoughts there?
Sorry, Andrew, was that aimed at me?
Yes, Howard, yes.
I just lost the connection for a moment or two. Yes, for me, the TED Talk, the thing that is most amazing about that TED Talk is the fact that there have been 34 million views. And by that, I mean only 34 million. I wish more people had looked at it and learned from it. A fair bit of focus within the TED Talk on the Ebola crisis, which, for those who don't have the recollection, we're talking about 2014 or something along those lines. But one of the things that is in my mind is that, and Mike referred to the floods and the chaos that caused. There's quite an interesting case study with Associated British Ports, who reacted to the 2013 floods, and as an organisation was involved in continuity planning at quite a detailed level. They implemented a whole range of plans which I believe have stood them in good stead now for what has happened, and that came off the back of the of flooding. They presented in as I understand it, a number of different instances about what their study was and how they undertook it. But I think the most important thing is that that work was undertaken with the involvement of CEO and CFO. And Bill Gates talks about the fact that the costs involved in preparing for a pandemic like the one we're facing are insignificant compared to the effects, the costs of being unprepared. For me, is what is massively important, because preparedness is so valuable, and we have not got a situation for sure where enough preparedness was done on a global basis. Bill Gates described it as a global failure. There was not enough preparedness. There was not enough learning from things like, and I would just recommend that anybody goes and has a look at what Bill Gates said. I think it is very prescient.
Yeah, I kind of have a feeling it's going to be sort of mandatory viewing for future business continuity planning and scenario planning. Is the way he laid it out was quite nice, and that point on the cost of reacting to this is going to be far more than the cost of maybe getting prepared in advance. And I suppose coming maybe to you, Louise, on that sort of cost perspective, I mean, you know, we've grown up in finance, very much a cost focus. But is that the right way we should be thinking about these sort of things? Is it now we're in a cost minimization phase, or should we be thinking how can we capture the best value remaining after the situation that we're finding ourselves in from this crisis or any other crisis? Is the right approach cost minimization or value capture or value maximization?
I think it needs to be both, and to an extent it depends on your individual business circumstances. So I guess you can always the best thing to be able to do is turn a negative into a positive. So some organisations will have been able to share their resources, and instead of only being able to take 80% of a government grant to support their pay bills, they may well have been able to loan their workforce to an organisation whose volumes are going through the roof, because we know that the shelves in the stores were empty immediately, so production will have stood up, and you know, supply chains of certain products went beyond Christmas peaks. So there's opportunities for organisations who do prepare early and do have those teams looking for opportunities. So that was an opportunity for one organisation to recover 100% of its wage costs and people related costs, and keep people occupied, because people are not used to sitting at home doing anything. So that's an opportunity, and I think businesses should always have a team looking at that. But then of course, dependent on your business, and if I think of the particular business unit I'm looking after at the moment, the volume disappeared. So the revenue streams stopped almost overnight, and therefore cost control was really, really key. So I think it's just having that flexibility in the finance team to look at the various big pictures and get a nice balance between opportunity but not exploitative, and cost reduction at the same time. I think the two can go hand in hand.
That was an interesting. I thought that was a very creative solution, actually, to try and, you know, keep the wages going. That was I hadn't heard of that one, Louise. That's very interesting, and I think it's very similar to the point Mike made actually about saying this, some franchisees, when their revenue stops, that is the business grinding to a halt. Yeah. So actually, coming over to you, Mike, because I remember reading one of your presentations, and you had some golden rules for how we should manage crises. Would you mind maybe sharing that with some of our listeners, please?
Yeah, sure. Well, and these rules have been developed over time and refined over time, but I'm not pretending they're my rules entirely. But just sort of before anyone thinks it's painted, the information's available, but it's quite a simple way of keeping the whole thing together. So the first golden rule is about risk management, which the whole business needs to be involved in. And this is before a crisis happens. So this is looking at the consequences and the likelihood. Now, if you apply that to coronavirus, clearly the consequences are severe, but probably the likelihood until recently was considered quite low, having SARS and things gone before. So how we get these things into the eye is quite difficult. But having this assessment of the risks that your business faces, consequences and likelihood, is the key number one, and the whole business needs to be part of that. Then when the crisis breaks, you need to get the experts together. So whether it's people involved with the suppliers, the products, the supply chain, the customer, to actually sit around the table, identify what the issues are, what's gone wrong, what needs to be done, and then in any case, break the group into groups looking at specific areas. So everyone doesn't look at everything. You have a customer team, a products team, a supplier team that come together and talk to each other as the crisis develops. Clearly operating with the facts and the figures, avoiding speculation and opinion where possible, deal with facts and act on facts, identify the stakeholders involved. So if in a franchisee business, there's the franchisees themselves, there's third parties, as well as suppliers and your own staff. Identify those people and then effectively communicate. So you tailor your message to the various stakeholders depending on what they need to know about. So the government coronavirus heading is clearly to the people. There'll be other communications going on to industry and to heads of industry, so that recipient knows what they've been told, understands what they've been told, and acts on it accordingly. And those principles work for most incidents.
Yeah, I think that ties nicely, Mike, in terms of what Louise was saying earlier about the communication and the importance of that, this communicate principle. Yeah. And also, to Howard's point around the CEO and the CFO coming together, or really, finance and the business, because, you got that visibility across the various different areas. I mean, I suppose, Howard, what is sort of some positive next steps that we should be taking as we sort of learn from this crisis to better prepare for future ones and emerge strong from the current one we're in? What do you think there, Howard?
I think for me, probably the most important thing is that it's the rebuilding from here onwards, because there are opportunities. Don't waste a crisis. There are opportunities to actually show in each and every business that you've managed the situation in a way that builds positive perceptions. You are talking about, there are, as I say, plenty of things that we can all learn from in situations like this. But probably the most important thing is not actually the learning full stop. It's the improving of your processes, the improving of the resilience within the business to cope with these sort of things forward. And that improving only comes as a result of making sure that the learnings are shared, and there's value in certain organisations, whoever that might be. I'm not suggesting that there's a particular organisation within our business community that should take the lead, but realistically is in the best interests of businesses, as we said, to learn from each other in this. And if you, for example, go back to the TED Talk for an analogy that's worthwhile doing, The last testing and exercises that were undertaken in the US, for example, prior to Ebola, were in 2001. So that's a 13-year gap between doing exercises that were designed to help the state of preparedness for something of this sort. And that was between 2001 and 2014. And in 2014, the case reports were still being prepared on paper.
Wow.
So you are talking about, in this modern world, how on earth could we not be geared up to actually be sharing that information in a better fashion than having case reports produced on paper? And that is just an analogy. The particular point again is about knowledge management. Let's go and share. I talked about Associated British Ports and the fact that what they then did, because they're part of the council, which is involved in these situations. So I think it's called the critical national infrastructure and learnings with the Department of Transport, for example, who were very interested, quite rightly, in knowing and understanding what's happening in this sort of type of situation in the maritime environments. And it is, for me, the most important thing is actually making sure those learnings are actioned in the right way.
Yeah, I think to do that, to Howard, it's probably going to be, so people have the right mental state to do that, because I think there's a lot of react mode at the moment, and probably that's going to require some sort of forward thinking. And I know Louise and myself, and I think we've all spoken on some degree, but I know Louise and myself did it quite recently, was talk about the mental health impacts of all of this, so we can actually, because I think you touched the word, Howard, resilience. I think that's a key word from this, but also how can we leverage that resilience in a positive way moving forward, so we're learning from it. Louise, from the mental health side of things, are sort of any things that you are seeing that are being quite effective at the moment, or things that we maybe need to focus on so we fully open ourselves up to this learning opportunity here?
Yeah, I mean, mental health is a topic for everybody at the moment. We see more and more situations where people struggle, and this is a typical, I guess, situation that's alien to a lot of people. You have little social interaction, and so therefore it can put those vulnerable people and people who didn't know they had a mental health issue under some pressure. So from, I think, again, we talk about this communication. It's more and more important to be in touch with your people. I think it's important to let people know it is okay to do things differently, to mix up your day. Everybody knows that schools are out. People have got responsibilities looking and caring for children, trying to homeschool them. Some people will be suffering financially if they have been, lost their job or even furloughed and not receiving that 100% of their pay. So I think it's just letting people know it is okay to do things differently. If you need to have a couple of hours off during the day to support a child, then do it. It's all right. We're all in this together. We've never done it before. We've got to support each other through it and come out the other side in a positive way and take the positives out of those challenges. So, for instance, we now all can work at home effectively. Those who have had to, not those essential workers who've had to stay out and about on the roads and in the warehouses and so on. So let's learn from those positives and keep connected. So we have in our team, just to make sure everyone's okay, we have calls twice a day, every day. We didn't do that before. We probably had a call once a week. We had a wider team call once a month. We do that wider team call every week now. It's not necessarily about business updates. It's not necessarily talking about the negatives of the situation. We're trying to mix things up and keep positive. We've introduced, just made people more aware of helplines that are available. And we talk about how we're all feeling. Again, subjects that we don't always talk about or a bit taboo. So yeah, mental health is a big issue, but something we can take a positive from. Let's talk about how we feel more going forward.
I like that, Louise. And I suppose, look, I mean, the last 30 minutes we spent debating this out is really flown by. So I'm going to challenge all of you now to maybe come up with some parting thoughts for our audience to take away and put into practice so we can move forward from this. Mike, maybe if I come to yourself first, would it be sort of any parting thoughts that you could recommend our audience take away from the last discussion we've had?
You know, I would say don't lose heart. You know, there's been plenty of crises in the past. There'll be plenty more in the future. And if we apply ourselves and the experience we have around us, we'll get through this and we'll get through others. I'm very happy we want to share the principles or the golden rules in a way which the audience could look at. But there's always hope. And as Louise just said, the talking to each other, sharing with each other, supporting each other, communicating with each other is part of getting through that, because it is difficult for people, particularly with the home thing. When everyone's in the office together, you've got a bit more of a club, more difficult separated, but we can reach across those gaps, keep people in the loop, keep people informed, and keep them comfortable that things are okay. And as Louise said, it's okay to walk out and have a bit of fresh air and leave your desk for 5 minutes. You know, these things are perfectly all right. So we'll be great. We'll get through this.
Yeah, I like that, Mike. Thank you so much for the positivity there, and again, sharing the golden rules. Coming to you, Howard, next. Are there any parting thoughts for our audience to take away from today's discussion?
Yes, I think the truth is, as I mentioned earlier, the situation and of course the supply chains themselves, which are quite often global, they are complex. But as Mike has demonstrated, and he actually used the word a while back, the concepts are simple. The concepts of how to handle this crisis and others remain very, very, very simple, those golden rules. I think probably the most important thing, without a shadow of a doubt, rather like Mike's sentiment of one can get through this. I think we certainly can, if the learnings are shared, and in particular the businesses test their processes, and as Bill Gates exhorted, don't put it off. That's the most important thing. Don't you let it slip away. Do something positive with it reasonably shortly, when you've got all the information together. Not now, we're still in the throes of it, but a little bit further down the track, actually undertake an exercise and learn from it.
Yeah, I think that's where finance are very strong. I think it's definitely putting the facts, getting the facts together, putting it out there, testing the processes. To your point and Mike's point, it's the simple stuff. If we just do that well, maybe now is not the right time, but just to have it front of mind when we emerge, so we do it. And again, it's great that you've come on to share your stories with each other. Maybe that's the thing we need to do better is talk more with each other, share what works, what doesn't work. And even that's what Louise mentioned previously, a very creative solution to keep the cost covered for staff as well. And I suppose in terms of finally, Louise, coming to yourself, maybe any parting thoughts for our audience following our discussion?
I suppose for me it would be reflect on the fantastic things that everybody's done, whether that's governments, suppliers, people in your team, countries working together. We have stood up and made massive decisions in a really short space of time. And so let's learn, well, now we know we can do that. What might the world look like when we're out of this situation if we can continue to operate that way?
That's an awesome challenge laid out to our audience. I can't wait to see what the world looks like in a year's time. So Louise, Howard, Mike, thank you so much for coming on and sharing with our SITN audience some great advice, thoughts, experiences, and appreciate you investing your time with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you,
You're
Andrew.
very welcome.